Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, and today we're going to talk about toxicology. So, toxicology is kind of an interesting field and can be, often it can be kind of that connection between sociology, economics, and the environment that we're so interested in when we talk about natural resource management. Take, for example, a river system or stream system that looks like this, or a drainage ditch that looks like this, and you notice all these tires in the water, and a lot of algae build up, which means there's probably high levels of nutrients in the water system. And for that fact, you can go all over the United States and see river systems and streams and drainages that look just like this. So we often are interested in, well, what's the cost to the environment to have all this garbage and material in the system? What's the cost to the society to remove it? And what's the potential health cost? Where is this, running into? Is this running into a stream or a river that people fish out of? And so you can get these pollutants being bioaccumulated in say a fish. Is this water system going into another water system where people drink the water out of it? What's going on? So toxicology is a fairly interesting system, and is often in the news for either making certain individuals really mad, for what's often called throwing the red flag, or blowing the whistle on companies. But in the end, I think organizations like the EPA and water rights organization, clean air organizations, and things like that are doing the right thing for the environment most often. In some cases, they make mistakes. They're people. Um, but I think overall the goal is to make sure that our water systems don't end up looking like this one. Okay, so let's dive into funding healthcare a little bit, or funding, uh, just general environmental protection or human protection for that matter. Now, when we look at the the funding of healthcare, or when we look at the funding of environmental costs and cleanup and things like that, most often the burden falls hardest on the poorest people. It's not, maybe it's not because they choose to live in regions that have been damaged environmentally, but that's where either state housing, government housing, these kind of things are often put, is in regions where the land is really cheap. Well, there's reasons for really cheap land often, and that's because it was, maybe an old factory was torn down there, an old dump site or something like that, and it gets cleaned up, and the land is, repurposed. That can be problematic, because the poor people then can be subjected to extreme health consequences. The other thing, we can talk about health care in general. And I mean, I don't think it's a no-brainer whether you agree with the Affordable Health Care Act or not. I think it has some flaws, and I think it also has some huge benefits. When we talk about, a lot of people in the United States now have health care that didn't prior to the Affordable Health Care Act. I think most people would agree that's a good thing. That means people are getting, checked out, and are going to the hospital versus going to the emergency room when they get a cold, or have an infection or something like that. They're not going to the emergency room. Instead, now with healthcare, they're going to a primary doctor, And I think that benefits medical people so they can actually deal with true emergencies, but it also benefits the individuals that are poor that are now under the Affordable Health Care Act. Okay? But there are some flaws. Don't get me wrong. I'm not promoting one way or the other. Um, there are benefits and there's cost to both, and but I'll tell you that there's a lot of people that now have health care that didn't, okay? And that's probably a good thing. According to the World Healthcare Organization, 90% of all the disease burdens occur in developing countries, and 10% of the dollars spent are spent on those developing countries. So when we talk about disease outbreaks, which we talked about before, malaria, Zika virus, Ebola, and we talk about, bird flu, and we talk about all these other potential outbreaks and diseases that have occurred in everyone's lifetime that's watching this video. 90% of that going on, at least 90% of the real burdens that happen occur in developing countries, poor countries, okay? And, there's very little money to be spent on healthcare. And so even though if you get, say, the Zika virus or Ebola or, any of these others in a developed country, you have a much higher chance of living, first of all. And part of that is because you have a much better chance of being seen right away and have a lot more money spent on the care of you as an individual than you would if you were in a developing country. So there's been lots of suggestions from the World Health Organization, from other groups, humanity groups and whatnot, that we really need to look at these developing countries and give them some more financial aid to reduce the burden that some of these really, I don't want to downplay the severity of some of these diseases, but a lot of these diseases, I mean, we have vaccinations for them. You can cure the people from those diseases. And, a lot of that evidence suggests that if you stabilize the populations of some of these developing countries, so people are not reproducing because they realize that if I reproduce 8 children, at least 4 of them are going to die before the age of 5. So that means I have 4 children. What will we see when developing countries become developed is they stop having 8 children. So they have fewer offspring, and they tend to be healthier offspring to begin with. And so it's also goes back to ecology, where we've talked about this from an ecological point of view. There are K species and R species, and we are a K species. We reproduce very few offspring. We take care of them to promote them living a long lifespan, but it's not always black and white whether you're K or R. Under circumstances, poor circumstances, K species can act a lot like R species. Reproduce a lot, have very little child care, and hope for the best. And that's what we see in some developing countries. All right, so toxicology. Toxicology is really just the study of poisons or toxic chemicals and their effects on living organisms. These can be found in the air, food, clothing, water, housing material, lots of things. And that's really what toxicology is all about, is looking at those poisons and what's their effect on living tissue or living organisms. So we can divide chemicals into two main categories. First, we have toxic chemicals. And these are known poisons that will damage cells and tissue. And often they are very specific chemicals, and they affect very specific tissues. They also can be harmful even under really diluted concentrations. So if we find, certain chemicals in water, or we find certain chemicals in food or the air or something like that, it's a automatic red flag. Look, these are known to damage cells and kill tissue. Okay? Like lead in your water. We know that. Or lead paint, lead, particles in food, mercury in fish, or mercury in other organisms. There's a lot of toxic, poisonous chemicals that we know, even under very low concentrations, they can have detrimental effects on human tissue. Okay? And it's not just humans. Okay, remember, we're also, from a natural resource management, we're also interested in the organisms, the other animals and other plants and other things that live in those environments that either we use as a resource or that other things use as a resource, or food source or something along those lines. And then there's what we call hazardous chemicals. Okay? And so these can be dangerous but not necessarily toxic. So, things like alcohol, or, and sometimes it's both. Like after a certain point, it becomes toxic. So like ethanol, after a certain percentage, it becomes a poisonous chemical. But under that percentage, it's just a hazard. It's highly explosive, or an irritant or something like that. Okay? So ecotoxicology deals with both the toxic and hazardous chemicals, and then how do they interact with the environment. Often we're interested in what we call the half-life of that chemical, or how long does that chemical stay in the environment at the toxic level or at the hazardous level. Okay? How does it dissipate out? Can it be diluted with water? Is it diluted, or does it get accumulate in the soils? Does it accumulate in plant tissue? What's going on? And so that's really what ecotoxicology is about, is tracking some of these hazardous or toxic chemicals through the environment. So there are a few different types of toxins. Okay? There's allergens, which most people are very familiar with, and these can be kind of minute things or super severe things. So you could be like allergic to, say, sagebrush, pollen from a sagebrush or something like that. That's going to activate your immune system to recognize pollen from a sagebrush as a foreign body. And you're going to, sneeze, try to get that pollen out. Your eyes are going to water, try to get the pollen off of your eye lenses. Okay, you might swell up a little bit. You might cough to try to get it out of the lungs. These are all innate responses. These are all genetically controlled responses to remove pollen or whatever the substance is, allergens. This could be dog hair, horse hair, all kinds of things. Okay, grass. Tons of different things. Those are general kind of responses to an allergen. Now it could be all the way to severe. Okay, you could go into shock because of it. So if you're allergic to, say, bee venom, okay, and so if you get stung by a bee and you go into anaphylactic shock, your body is reacting to that, but it's sending your body into shock from it, and you can die from it. So allergens can both be really, really simplistic and benign, fairly benign, all the way to you know, very severe reactions to things. Okay, so this goes to kind of your immune system response, and so this is how allergens work. You produce antigens, um, and an antigen is recognized by a specific antibody on white blood cells. And in some cases, in some individuals, you will recognize an antigen like pollen or dog hair, horse hair, etc. And it's just based on your immune system. You recognize that as a foreign substance and you build up white blood cells to fight it off. So you have antibodies to get rid of it. Now, the interesting piece about the allergens, antigen, antibody system is that often we say people that have allergies, we often think of, oh man, you guys got a weak immune system. Actually, what they really have is an overactive immune system. Their immune system is reacting to things it shouldn't be reacting to. Right? If your immune system is reacting to grass, it's overreacting to that, and it can make your life very miserable if you have a green lawn or if you live in an area like the prairie where you have lots of grasses and lots of pollen. Your life can be really miserable. It's the same thing with peanut allergies and other kind of allergies. Just because you're allergic to the food doesn't mean that your immune system is terrible. It actually means your immune system is overactive and you're producing antibodies for something as simple as a food. We want antibodies to be produced. We just want them to be produced to fight off like different types of bacteria, fungi, viruses, these kind of things that are attacking our body. We want an antigen antibody response to that. But something as simple as, say, like peanuts, it happens often. But that's just an overactive immune system. And so, there's lots of ways in which this works. And if you're truly interested in, how an antigen antibody system works, how they evolve, I highly suggest watching, like a general biology lecture. I explain this in general biology also. Or you can just Google another video where they talk about how phagocytes engulf foreign bodies, and then they present it on their complement system or present it on the MHC system to your other types of white blood cells like lymphocytes and things like that, and they can form memory or form antibodies based on that. Okay. Now, there are systems or there are toxins in the environment that can cause an allergen or a severe reaction, okay? And we often see these in preserved materials sometimes or in the environment in different ways, like formaldehyde, okay, and carbon monoxide. These can cause sick building syndrome, which causes your immune system to basically malfunction. And so your white blood cells malfunction and overproduce antibodies and can cause you to form severe reactions to different allergens. There are immune system depressants, and these are pollutants that will block the immune system or depress the immune system. They can do this by blocking the formation of antibodies, messing with the formation of antibodies, or destroying white blood cell counts. And sometimes those happen. We have endocrine disruptors. Sometimes we find these in things like products that we use. We talked about this before when we said that we dope a lot of our domestic animals, cattle, pigs, chickens, and by giving them a bunch of antibiotics and doping them, and that runs out into the water system, we can get high levels of that doping agent that gets into the water system and messes with animals within the water system, whether that be frogs or fish or plants or insects. There's lots of different ways. And it truly would mess with humans too if they're drinking that water system. So those would be endocrine disruptors often, either produce too much estrogen or block the production of estrogen in some organisms. Sometimes too much testosterone is produced, and it could just be that we're utilizing a chemical to maybe herbicide which is destroying plants, an insecticide or something like that. And when it mixes with other chemicals in the environment or when it gets into the water system, it has a complete different effect on the organisms. So right now I'm going to switch over and allow you to watch this video on the role that things like endocrine disruptors play in ecological systems.
If an entire class of animals that's been around for millions and millions of years is rapidly declining and potentially going extinct, we really need to think about what we've done and if our advances will eventually harm us all. I really like the science. I like solving the puzzle. I like the CSI. I also like frogs, and so I also feel a real drive to help understand how pesticides and other chemicals are affecting amphibian populations.
Hayes and his students have been looking for clues in the Salinas Valley.
50% of the U.S.'s agricultural products come out of California. Something like 85% of the country's lettuce comes out of Salinas, 90% of the almonds. It's called the salad bowl of America. California uses more pesticides than any other state. The second biggest is Florida. Things like chlorpicrin is used out here on the strawberries. Chlorpicrin is a nerve gas. These are guys who are applying it, they're out there picking it. Methyl bromide is a fumigant, something they pump into the soil. What are some of the other big ones, you guys?
Diethanol.
Some atrazine. This will all end up in the river that we're working in here. It might look like we're out in the bush somewhere, but 15 feet on either side, we're surrounded by agriculture, and the runoff ends up in this river. All of the algae is a result of all the nutrients, because a lot of fertilizers are used in agriculture. And once those fertilizers get into the water, you get these blooms of algae. I wouldn't say it's a sign of a healthy river. This is a site where we typically find compromised immune systems, tadpoles that aren't able to fight off disease. Our data so far suggests that the mixture of pesticides causes an increase in stress hormones, and those stress hormones cause immunosuppression, which leads to the inability to respond to any kind of disease pathogen.
While investigating chemical runoff, Hayes stumbled on another culprit.
We started going to Salinas River looking for the native red-legged frog, and it turns out that it has been completely replaced on the river by bullfrogs. This invasive bullfrog itself is one of the causes for decline in many of these areas. And so we're studying them in areas where they're not doing well to try to understand what may be driving some of the native species to extinction.
Entrepreneurs transported bullfrogs from the East Coast, hoping to farm them for food. Instead, they unleashed a carnivore that has decimated California's native frogs. It seems that even the tough bullfrog isn't doing so well with the toxins in this water. Back at Berkeley, Hayes is studying another non-native. African clawed frogs were once used in human pregnancy tests, but when they became obsolete, many were discarded. These were collected from streams around California.
We're removing an invasive frog, and we're studying them to try to understand declining amphibians.
Hayes is testing the effects of chemicals like atrazine, a common herbicide.
We have a whole family of animals where we've eliminated the female chromosome.
Specimen 01.
These animals that we know are genetic males have been exposed to atrazine for their entire life. And many of these genetic males now are turning into females. You can see he's got eggs that kind of look like they're in a sac. These are actually yolked eggs ready to be laid. What's happening is you're skewing sex ratios. You can get genetic bottlenecking, which can cause crashes. And quite frankly, if you're a genetic male, it'd be nice if you developed as a genetic male. And now we have a chemical very common in the environment that's effectively sex reversing animals. I'm going to show you something pretty amazing, scientifically speaking. The one that's sort of remarkable is this pair. These are both males. The one on the bottom, acting as the female, we affectionately refer to as Darnell. He's a genetic male that not only acts like a female, he lays eggs like a female. She has been exposed to atrazine all of her life. I don't even really know how to reference it. This is Darnell's third clutch. So Darnell has sons and daughters that we've grown up. You can see eggs in the bottom. This is actually her second clutch for today. She has been copulating for getting close to 24 hours now. This is probably one of the most remarkable things I've seen in my work. But I personally have mixed emotions. I'm very excited about the science and trying to understand the mechanism. But on the other hand, I am worried. This is the most common contaminant in ground and surface water and drinking water. And the level of atrazine that it took to make this male turn into a female is 3 times less than what's allowed in our drinking water. I really think that the global amphibian decline is telling us something about human health.
The toxins in our waters are reaching well beyond frogs. Reproductive abnormalities have been reported in everything from alligators to polar bears to humans.
It's not just a problem with frogs we should be concerned about. The water that's causing their problems is the same water that we're drinking and using to water our crops.
Frog or human, we all breathe the same air and drink the same water. For their sake and ours, experts agree we have to take action, and there's no time to lose.
Okay, so there you can see a video from Dr. Hayes and his research at the University of California. Hayes has been researching atrazine and other chemicals for a long period of time. I know him personally. I've been to many conferences with him, and his research is legit, but really concerning. I know he said in the video that he's pretty excited about it. I don't think he's excited anymore. That video is a little bit old, because now we're finding it in lots of organisms, largemouth bass, trout, lots of different species of fish that can occupy rivers inside city limits, are becoming hermaphroditic, so they'll produce both male and female parts or switch, and it's never been documented before that those species can do that, but now they're doing that, and most likely it's due to the endocrine disruptors or the toxins that are in our water system. And that should be concerning to most people, at least it's concerning to me, is that there's very few city water systems and very few water systems in the United States that the water for the individuals comes out of wells. It doesn't come out of the aquifers. It's coming out of surface runoff. So you're taking your water from a river system. And in those river systems, we're finding fish and amphibians and other organisms that have abnormal mutations, extra legs, extra gonads, different sex parts, these kind of things. And we can do it in a laboratory. We can reproduce it by providing them things that we find in the water system, chemicals like atrazine and BPAs and diotoxins and things like that. We can get it to happen inside a laboratory. So there's pretty good evidence that there's a direct connection between those. All right, so there's also other toxins that can occur, and neurotoxins, and typically neurotoxins are going to be in the form of things like heavy metals and stuff like that will affect the synapses of nerves or affect your ability to regulate metabolism or produce ATP. these other functions that a normal organism would need to do. And the one problem with a lot of neurotoxins is they can be extremely fast acting. So it can be literally exposure to it and you can have nerve damage that happens right away. And the thing about damaging nerves is nerves are just one of those cells that we don't replenish through the cell cycle. Okay? The nerve cells that you're born with, not quite are the nerve cells that you die with, but you're very limited on the number of nerve cells you have. And so by forming or having neurotoxins, it can really do some major damage. Okay? So like I said before, heavy metals are really key to nerve cell damage and killing nerve cells. Other things like chlorinated hydrocarbons and other things that might be found in water systems due to spillage coming out of plants and whatnot. They can damage the membrane, so the shaft of like the axon on the nerve can be deteriorated from these hydrocarbons. Carbonates and organophosphates and things like that, they'll block the signaling, the potassium pumps, so you don't get a nerve impulse in your nerves. And there's just lots of ways where these toxins can affect nervous function. Right. There are also agents that we expose ourselves every day to, which we call mutagens, and sometimes we call them carcinogens. And these are chemicals that causes mutations or can increase the likelihood of a mutation to form. And when I say mutation, I'm talking about a genetic change. Okay, so you look at your genome, and I'm talking about what we call thymine dimers. This happens due to UV radiation. It's a known mutagen. If you don't put on sunblock or have melanifers that are darkened to prevent UV exposure, you increase the chances that the thymine on one side of your DNA will bind to each other and form what we call a thymine dimer, which causes a kink in your DNA and then causes a mutation or a potential mutation if it's not fixed. Now, you do have proofreading systems in your DNA that can come through and fix them. So not all mutagens are going to result in a tumor or birth defects or cancerous cells and things like that. But the more mutagens you're exposed to, the higher your chances are. Okay. So other things that we know are teratogens. Okay. These are things that can affect the development or the growth of, say, embryonic cells, the division of embryonic cell, and things like that. We know that alcohol can do this and cause fetal alcohol syndrome. Okay. And fetal alcohol syndrome, a lot of these things, and I'm going to be quite honest, a lot of these things we didn't know about until we exposed ourselves to them. Okay? And then after you expose yourself to them and you see the side effects, then the regulations get put on different things. For example, I know like when I was in undergrad, we used to clean all of our tables and our equipment and all kinds of things. We used to clean it with acetone. And acetone now is a known carcinogen. Now, people still clean their fingernails with it, but it is a known carcinogen, and we no longer use it in laboratory situations because of the known carcinogen. We use it in some experiments and things like that, but it's not the acetone to wash down the desk that you would always use in laboratory situations because it's a carcinogen. So there's lots of things out there, and people say, well, everything's a carcinogen. Well, in some cases, lots of things, far more than we ever classify as carcinogens. If you were exposed yourself to enough of it, it might be a carcinogen, yeah, which really just means that it could cause mutation in your DNA. And if it causes a mutation in your DNA, all cancer is uncontrolled cell growth. So there's no stopping the cell from growing. And what often happens is you have, a mutation in your DNA that stops the checkpoints. So your cells have checkpoints that they have to make it through. And if you have a mutation that the checkpoint is the gates open, then the cell just keeps flowing through the cell system and just keeps reproducing massive numbers of cells over and over and over again and produces a tumor. And all a tumor is, at least a tumor that can metastasize or spread, is what we call cancer. So cancer, second leading cause of death worldwide. And I mean, you can look at these numbers, it's pretty scary for some people. If you're a guy, you got a 50-50 chance of developing cancer in your lifetime, and a girl about a 33% chance. So, that's pretty concerning. And these numbers, when I took my first general biology class, these numbers were 1 out of 7 males, and there was no difference between males and females. 1 out of 7 individuals. Now we're to 50% if you're a male. It's pretty serious stuff. Okay. Now diet. There is, again, we talked about cardiovascular disease, we talked about heart disease, and that's the leading cause of death worldwide. There is a correlation between high fat, high salt diets and cardiovascular disease. I said before that this is kind of a disease of the developed countries, of the energy-rich countries. Okay? And I'm not a dietitian. I'm not going to go into nutrition too much, but we already know the benefits of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, carbohydrates, things like that. Although the diet phases now, carbohydrates a bad word. I'll just let you know that carbohydrates are the best energy source you can give your body. It's the easiest for your body to break down without the side effects that protein has or lipids have. And so right now, today, about 60% of all U.S. adults is considered overweight, and 30% of U.S. adults are considered obese. Okay, so that's concerning, and that's going to lead to that cardiovascular disease piece there. So again, like I said before, I already gave you these numbers. 1 out of every 3 children in the United States will probably be diabetic by the time they hit adulthood. All right, so let's talk about what happens to toxins in the environment. How do they move through the environment? And so this really is determined by what we call the solubility of that toxin. Is that toxin polar? If that toxin is a polar molecule and can dissolve in water, then it can move through the environment pretty readily. If that toxin is nonpolar and cannot move through water, then it has to be absorbed in kind of fat tissues or lipids and then taken in that way. And so 2 major groups, either dissolved in water, so hydrophilic molecules, or dissolved in oil or fats, hydrophobic molecules. So there's, which one's better, which one's worse? It just depends on where you're getting it. If it's a water-soluble molecule, it can move from the source of the pollution, away from there extremely rapidly and get into an organism very, very fast. Okay? Now, the thing about water-soluble molecules is once they're in the organism, a lot of those toxins can also leave the organism very fast. Okay? Through urine and defecation, your body can expel those toxins fairly fast. Because water-soluble compounds don't readily enter the cells. Okay? So the cell membrane prevents them from just entering into the cell. Now, fat-soluble compounds are a little bit different. It's harder for them to be carried in the environment, but once inside the body, they penetrate tissues very easily because they're nonpolar and they can move through the membrane, and they can be stored in the body for a long period of time. So you can build up these toxins over a long period of time. And so here you can see different, pollution types. You can see you can get oxidation, you can get pollutions coming from the air through precipitation. Okay, you can get sources. I mean, it can be everything. It could be, birth control pills, soap to clean your car with, DEET materials and things like that that are going to get into the water system or into the air, these different things. And sometimes they can get captured by the soil and they can be released back into the water over a long period of time, or captured into the plant tissue, and then the plants store that, and then when the plant dies, it's all released in one big flow back into the water system. Same thing with animals. So how it gets back into the water, how it gets into the air, really just depends on the source, whether it's hydrophilic, hydrophobic, and what organisms have it. The things that we don't know about, I mean, we know some things that we consume and utilize constantly are known carcinogens, but the role that they play in developing our health or determining our health, some of them it's hard to say. I mean, we know, like drinking water, we know what the minimums and maximums should be. That doesn't mean that's always the case. I mean, Flint, Michigan is a really good example of that. Cosmetics, of course, they have to be, passed by different procedures and things like that. But nonetheless, exposure to these over and over again can have some deals. Food, same thing. Remember, there's regulations on food and all these things, but overexposure to some of these things can really cause some health effects. Air, all kinds of things. It depends on what your occupation is. So, if you're breathing in exhaust, or if you're inhaling different types of chemicals off of, different things while you're doing your job, there can be some extended circumstances that can cause some major health issues. So really it comes down to exposure and susceptibility. We know that air toxins can affect a lot of people, right? And you quickly can pick up air toxins. So you have exposure to them quite readily. We know that, like, individuals that occupy regions where there's lots of toxins will often have lung disorders and things like that, black lung disease, other things that are going on, monoxide poisoning. There's lots of different ways in which this can occur, and it's because the lining of our lungs is very porous and allows for us to absorb many things, including the toxins. Food, water, skin, okay, some of these we know very well what's going on. Others we're just learning, what kind of toxins there can be and what's the result. And a lot of times the problem is the chemical that's normally used is perfectly fine, but when it's combined with another chemical, so maybe you're eating certain food that has a chemical in it, but you're also taking medicine that has another chemical in it. Combined, they can have a different effect on your system, and we often don't know this kind of stuff. So industrial settings is by far the largest toxin exposure. We know this from water sources, air sources, just pollutants in general. Industrial settings are by far the most. The other thing that we know is that it depends on when you get exposed to that. So susceptibility is greatly dependent on the age of the individual, at least when we're talking about human susceptibility. We know that children are way more vulnerable than adults. So something a toxin that we might find in just typical hamburger meat or something like that that's store-bought might be perfectly fine for adults, and adults are not very susceptible to it. But for exposing children to that, it could show long-term effects on the individual. And this is exactly what we saw with Flint, Michigan. Adults that were drinking the water, they tasted it and they knew that something was wrong, but children were getting sick and had extreme health issues because of the water sources. The adults weren't getting sick like that, but the children were from the lead that was in the pipes. Okay, so with that, we're going to move and talk more about environmental health and in next lecture, and we'll probably hit on some regulations that are put forth, some regulations that probably need to go away because they're very old, but other regulations that might need to stay in place and maybe even further adapted for the benefit of the society, and countries that have no regulations and where they're at. Okay, so next time we'll talk about that.